Hi, I'm Jon Sasala, president of Morey Creative Studios.
And I'm Jed Morey, the CEO and founder of Morey Creative Studios.
We are a Diamond HubSpot partner agency with offices in New York and Philadelphia.
And today we wanted to talk to you about podcasting and HubSpot and how podcasting fits perfectly within HubSpot's inbound marketing methodology.
Yeah. So before we get started, who exactly is this presentation for? We're really speaking to businesses looking to either start a branded podcast, or if you have an existing podcast and you wanted to leverage it better in the inbound way, this presentation is for you. First, let's talk about why podcasting and why now. There are some statistics that we have on the screen here. 144 million Americans have listened to a podcast at some point in their lives. And I think there are like 300 or 320 million Americans.
That's right.
Is that right? So about 50% of all Americans out there have listened to a podcast at some point in their lives. 90 million of those Americans have listened in the last month, and 62 million have listened in the last week. And weekly listeners tend to actually listen to a lot of podcasts, somewhere in the range of an average of like 7. So people who are engaging with podcasts really are engaging. And the trend is certainly heading in the right direction. As far as a new medium where people prefer to spend their time, it's growing exponentially year after year, I think, as we're all aware.
Now, one of the things that we face as an agency is people will come to us, clients will come to us all the time and ask us whether or not they should have a podcast. So we've been doing a lot of research. We have our own podcasts. We have a social justice podcast called Newsbeat. We produce our own agency podcast, and then we have podcasting as a service that we perform for clients. And the game has changed so much over the years, and so have the analytics. So you see that the popularity of podcasts has grown with the growth of shows like Joe Rogan and Mark Maron. Mm-hmm. Serial was one of the shows that really put podcasting on almost an even playing field with other mediums. So podcasting really took off over the last few years. And one of the things that we found most surprising, is you'll see the statistics on the screen now, is that in-home listening has grown dramatically. So has, obviously, people are listening in their cars. They're listening when they're walking around, while they're doing other activities. It's a format that you can be fully engaged in and do something else at the same time. But that growth of in-home listening is one of the areas that not only took us by surprise, but it's one of the areas that we want to focus on for the future, because that means that voice-enabled devices are playing these podcasts at home. And now podcasts have entered that final realm of being not only in your car, on your phone, at work, but also in your home. And that's what's made podcasting so ubiquitous and why we're talking about it today.
Yeah, and it makes sense because if you look at the frame that we have here, the things that people are looking to get from podcasting are things like to learn something new, to be entertained, to stay up to date, maybe with the latest trends or topics, down the line, all the way to companionship.
But you have to be careful when you're thinking about starting a business podcast, because I think the temptation is to go and mimic what's already out there and what's already popular. And it's important to note that if you want to come up with an inspiring business podcast, as an example, you still want to pick a topic, stay in your lane, and stay very focused on what it is that you do for a living, because not everybody's going to become the next Tony Robbins.
Right. Yeah. Identifying what that thing is that's unique to you. Why are you special? How, is your host, whoever you choose, very connected, or is the specific service or technique that you go about something very unique? Are you different? Because if you're not different, it's a very competitive landscape. We can actually look at how competitive it is. People are maybe intimidated when they learn that there are 700,000 podcasts out there. That's a lot, right? But if we put that in the context of how many websites there are out there, there are 1.5 billion websites. Does that mean that you're too late to the game and shouldn't have a website? Or if you look at how many people are blogging, there are 500 million blogs out there. So you're not going to spend the effort trying to blog and trying to rank. 2 million blog posts are actually published every single day. So now when we look at the context of there are only 700,000 podcasts, we're really getting into this and thinking about this at the beginning of a burgeoning industry.
So now let's bring it back to HubSpot marketing, inbound marketing, HubSpot's methodology writ large. Where does podcasting fit in the general landscape for all digital marketing? And one of the things that we've paid a lot of attention to, and I know a lot of our colleagues in the industry have paid a lot of attention to, the fact that the real estate that we're all fighting for on the search engines is beginning to shrink. So if you could talk a little bit about the SERPs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love talking about this. There's so many people that are, up in arms and furious that Google is changing the way that they're delivering results. And what used to be just 10 blue links that we were fighting for has been replaced by knowledge graphs and position zero and, carousels and all sorts of different opportunities that are not the traditional, articles that we've been ranking for. Not only that, but all of these search results actually not resulting in a click. Google doing a great job of delivering an answer right there in the results. Now, most people in our industry say that's a bad thing, but think about it from the user perspective. That is incredible. And if Google is doing a better job of delivering results, we as inbound marketers and content developers need to simply figure out how to end up on those positions, in those spots, and deliver a good experience. So a few years ago, whenever video started getting introduced to the search results pages, you saw them as a tab. You had images, news, like recent and videos. And that's how you would have to go and access videos. Well, now videos are being introduced as the actual results mixed in and above those 10 blue links. So you've got your ads up there, you've got your videos. We're now seeing podcasts do the exact same thing. Google has announced that they've successfully indexed all of those 700,000 podcasts, every single episode. And when I say index, I don't just mean title and description. They're able to listen to the context of the article, of the podcast, and figure out exactly what people are discussing. So now when you search for something, podcasts can show up. Oh my God. It's incredible, right?
That's right.
Now, right now, if you go and search for any query and add podcast to the end, that will bring you that podcasting carousel where you have a couple different options of what you can listen to. But you can imagine a world in the future, in the very near future, where you don't have to include podcast and it just starts delivering audio clips. And really, depending on what device you're on, if you're on a mobile device, it's going to be very likely that you're getting a mix of video and audio instead of articles. Because reading an article on a phone is not as good of an experience as listening to something. So you can see a world where all of this content that we're producing in the audio space starts being delivered just as competitively on the search results. So that brings me to this idea that we had a few years back called Read, Watch, Listen. Jed, do you want to talk about that initiative?
Yeah, sure. We had an idea that actually played out really well in one format, and that was the watch format. This idea of read, watch, listen was if Google's going to serve our answer as an agency blogging on behalf of our client, if we put together a great pillar page as an example, as an answer to a search query, and we begin to rank for it, but then our competitor does the same thing, how can we differentiate our content and have a stronger answer? And for us, the answer was to embed a video that we called a pillar strengthening video. Because if Google has an option to serve your result and your competitor's result, and only one of them has a video, chances were that the video, the piece of content with the video on it would be served ahead of the other one.
Because it's a little bit more engaging. It's multimedia that's included. Not to mention, one of the biggest ranking signals that Google uses is time on site. So if your article, somebody without a video might skim through it, spend 20 seconds on there, but they get to the video and it's a 2-minute video. Well, now they've spent 2 minutes and 20 seconds. So you're going to beat out that other guy that does not have a video embedded.
Right. And that picks up on the phenomenon of videos being served in a carousel. So it might actually be the video that was more discovered than even the original piece of content if you did it right and people began to engage with it. So we were curious about how audio would perform, and that's why we came up with this concept of read, watch, listen. We knew that strengthening pillar pages with related videos was a good idea because we saw the analytics and we saw it working. So we wondered if audio could do the same thing.
And we also look at the world always through an upcycling opportunity where we say, hey, we've written this big, beautiful, incredible article. How else can we share with people?
Right.
So we would record just the read version of that exact article and embed it there on their website. Not really hosted anywhere else, but just embedded on the website.
So unfortunately, it was kind of a clunky and bad user experience. It wasn't the best format that we could serve the audio in. So as we looked at the analytics, so we're nowhere near as strong as video analytics or just the original analytics on a pillar page as an example. But we knew we were onto something because with the growth of podcasting, we knew that audio was beginning to be consumed at a much higher rate than it previously was. We just didn't have the right answer and the right format for it. The other issue was discoverability. There was nothing that we were doing to optimize the audio content on that page itself that was going to allow it to be discovered by the search engines. So that's what Jon is referencing right now. That's what's changing. As discoverability increases, as podcasts are indexed as original content, as Google uses AI to go through the entire content of a podcast, translate that into metadata that can then be served in the search engines, inbound marketers need to pay attention because this is a true today format that is showing some benefits for you and for your clients.
So that brings us to where this type of audio content fits into the flywheel. As inbound marketers, we all know that we need to be producing content for every different stage of what a buyer goes through when they discover who we are, learn more about our services, and ultimately decide to make a decision. Not to mention that, potentially refer people, through the delight stage.
Now, this used to be called the funnel, the sales funnel or the marketing funnel, and the two had to kind of work together, and hopefully you attract a new prospect that comes through that sales funnel and then becomes a customer. More recently, Brian Halligan had announced the death of the funnel and introduced the flywheel, but it's a really good concept, particularly for podcasting, as you're going to see as we get further into the video. Podcasting is outstanding for that delight phase. And the delight phase, this is going to be kind of preaching to the choir for other inbound marketing agencies and those that are familiar with inbound marketing. That delight stage is the most difficult to really capture the essence of and to get that flywheel spinning. But that's why they've been spending so much time talking about servicing your existing customers and really creating evangelists for your company. And podcasting is an outstanding way to do it.
Yes.
But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about the flywheel itself and where these different pieces of content kind of fall in
Sure.
play.
Yeah. If we break down the flywheel and look at the different stages of attract, engage, and delight, let's think about that. In marketing is really concerned about attracting. They're obviously concerned about a few other stages, but then sales is really concerned about the engage process. And then your service team is really concerned about the delight. What kind of podcast can we produce for the attract stage? So you can think about this maybe as just a new vehicle for people to find your company. People who might not have found you otherwise, might not have found you through, search results, but they are finding you in an audio capacity. Or you could think about the content you're producing addressing problems the same way that you do in a blog way. So if you identify, well, here are the things that they're searching for because these are their pain points, produce an audio piece of content. And when that can be delivered as a result, it's now just a new vehicle to get them into your wheelhouse or get them into your ecosystem.
Right. Think back to that idea of discoverability. This wasn't really a good concept a year, 2 years ago, but this is happening right now.
Yeah.
So to be able to produce an audio piece of content that is served as the top result to a search query puts it firmly in the attract stage.
So you see the value there. What I really love about this is the content you can produce for the engage stage and the delight stage. For the engage stage, think about that as maybe your ability, once someone's aware of your company, through regular articles that brought them in, they find your podcast and they listen and they realize you are an authority in your space. You understand what you're talking about, and you really start fast tracking that trust process. You can be producing things that help them make a really valuable decision about purchasing your product, or producing things potentially for your sales team to leverage. When a salesperson is actually engaging with a lead, rather than relying on them to, have all of the information and have to be on a phone call to communicate it, they can provide, like, you had a question about PCI compliance. Check out this podcast that we recently did that addresses it and answers all of those questions. So you're giving that sales team tools to help them be more successful.
Now, we're also speaking from experience because this is how we've used our own agency podcast for how many years have we been doing it now?
We're on 3 years, season 6 right now.
Season 6 and 3 years. In the beginning, the agency podcast that we produced was really great for recruitment because it demonstrated a little bit of our culture, the knowledge, and it was sort of a deep dive into the way that we do what we do. Mm-hmm. It was a deep look into our work product and our work process. And then over time, we began to, as the podcast grew and it grew in popularity and we got more downloads, Jon started to reach out and get interviews with some really notable figures in the marketing world. And it turned into that expertise type of podcast. Now we're going to talk about two very distinct types of podcasts that we think fit the inbound methodology and that we want to bring forward today. There are a few different types of formats, but there are two specifically that we want to really explore. Ours would be that expertise podcast, and it has helped us with that engage stage without a doubt. It's also helped us close some business too, as we have some examples of of being pitted against some other agencies, but we had that podcast to demonstrate our expertise and our authority in this space, and ultimately it became the vehicle to close a couple of deals. Yeah. And you can use that as well.
Not to mention, I've actually heard from a specific direct sales rep over at HubSpot that they've used Inbound and Down as a way to help educate people considering HubSpot. So not only are we helping our own business, but we're helping other people that can leverage our content.
That's a beautiful thing. And that is really the core of that engage stage. So at every phase, you have to think about exactly where this initiative fits in, where it's going to benefit your customers. Mm-hmm. And just like inbound content, it should be helpful. none of this should be really self-serving. We're going to talk about a branded podcast versus an expertise podcast, but in either case, it really shouldn't be self-serving. It should be about leveraging ideas that are brought to you by external consumers and people that are interested in learning more. Just be helpful. That's the general tone that that's what's a principle that's guided all of us in inbound marketing and gotten us to where we are. This is no different.
Yeah. So to quickly touch on the delight stage, this type of content you could produce there, it's still helping people understand what you do very well. So if you're an existing customer and you can listen to a podcast, not only can that help them leverage your services better, but it also does this incredible thing where it makes them feel better about their investment. They say, I've invested money in your company and your service, and this feels good because they're good at what they do. So it's still helping build that trust and fuel that flywheel. Now let's briefly talk about the different types of podcasts that you can be producing. So the first one that Jed touched on there is the branded podcast. This branded podcast speaks, it's loosely tied to your company. It doesn't necessarily speak about your specific services. It speaks more generally to the interests of who your potential consumers might be. So let's think about that in the context of maybe like a Whole Foods podcast. What kind of things would a Whole Foods podcast talk about? They're not going to talk about which aisle can you find cereal in this week, or what their specials are.
Right. They're going to talk about sustainable farming, sustainably sourcing different food products, locally grown initiatives, better farming initiatives. They're going to talk about something that fits the culture and the lifestyle and the brand identity of Whole Foods, and not just, as Jon said, how to get a discount on aisle 6 this week. It's not a coupon episode.
Yeah.
So that's not specifically talking about running a large multinational grocery operation. That's not what it would do. It would be talking about the lifestyle that their customers align with, and then creating that engagement. If Whole Foods put out, I don't think they have a podcast.
I don't think so either.
But if Whole Foods put a podcast,
Whole Foods, reach out.
If Whole Foods had a podcast that they put out into the universe, they would automatically find the audience because they have such a great brand, and they would align with them around their initiatives. That's not an opportunity that every single business has.
No, it's an uphill climb for people who are not as well known as a Whole Foods.
Right. Yeah. So we don't really recommend the branded podcast necessarily for every business. In fact, I would say 95% of businesses that exist in the United States aren't meant to have a branded podcast, because you don't have that type of affiliation, that type of
notability.
Yeah, the affinity with your consumer base that a major brand like a Whole Foods does. But it's a good way to understand how to separate the two in your mind.
A great example of a podcast, and a lot of you probably are familiar with this, is HubSpot's Weird Work podcast. Yeah. Weird Work speaks specifically to people who need to find a job that satisfies them creatively and helps them go out and start a new initiative. So go and find work that you love. Well, how does that tie back into HubSpot? If you do make the decision to leave where you're at, to stop having a boss, to go and pursue something, well, you got to start somewhere with starting your business. And that ties directly back to the HubSpot Academy.
But it's a few steps removed, right? It's kind of a leap of faith on HubSpot's part to have a podcast like that. But it also makes all the sense in the world for HubSpot to have that podcast, because HubSpot's about making the world a better place and making life easier for businesses and entrepreneurs. So for them to be talking about the struggle of entrepreneurship in such a cool and quirky way makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, and with that, they have their ads, be it like pre-roll or mid-roll or post-roll ads that do tie it back to the company. It's very important to point out, if you go and pursue something like a branded podcast, you have to tie it back to your company. Because the worst case scenario would be you produce something beautiful and incredible, and it's found and people love it, and then they never come back and listen again and draw no correlation to your business. You need to make sure they're like, oh yes, and I know that company. Otherwise,
But it's about being one or two steps removed from being overly salesy. Yeah. That's not the purpose of a branded podcast. That really shouldn't be the purpose of any podcast. But in a branded podcast, you're talking about creating this affinity with your audience, or solidifying the existing affinity with your audience. The one that's more appropriate for almost every business that exists is, if you were to start a podcast, is what we call an eat podcast. Do you want to talk a little bit about why we?
Yeah, it's all about food and things you love to eat. No, EAT stands for expertise, authority, and trustworthiness. You might recognize this from Google's EAT as a ranking factor. Google looks at articles and say, do you demonstrate that you have expertise in a space? Do you have the authority, certifications, credentials, and are you trustworthy? Are there other signals like inbound links and things to demonstrate that you're a trustworthy source? Well, we want to do the same thing in the podcasting space.
The point of an EAT podcast is to break down your offering as a core business, to speak authoritatively about the thing that you do so that your prospects, your consumers, or other people in the industry can engage with you where they want to engage. So again, this isn't about creating a following. This isn't about becoming the most popular podcast. It's about putting out helpful inbound content marketing that people can engage with at the moment they're ready to engage. Mm-hmm. That's why we keep saying that this is just inbound marketing, but it's the audio version of it. There is no difference. Now that the search engines have caught up with it, why wouldn't you be producing an expertise podcast? Because the barriers to entry have really come down. People can do this. You just have to know how to produce it and how to leverage it through the distribution network so that it can be found.
Mm-hmm. The other two types of podcasts that I'll touch on quickly, one would be for internal purposes. This is a podcast that's not really necessarily intended for public consumption. Think about maybe like an onboarding program where you're hiring an incredible amount of salespeople week after week, month after month. And rather than having them go through like a written sales process or something manual where a sales manager needs to sit with them, you can produce content to help onboard them. A series of 10 episodes that talk about your culture, about your processes, about your way, about pitfalls, about whatever it might be. Now that's producing something that is only intended for internal consumption. But that doesn't mean that you have to gate it behind a wall. If you can take that type of content and put it so it's publicly accessible, and then you have people who are interested in engaging with your company, they happen to come across that, they listen and they're like, this company has incredible integrity and is very buttoned up. So yes, it's built for internal use, but it can also be leveraged still with that trust building process.
Now listen, I'm old enough to remember having giant packages of cassette tapes of sales training. And there would be like 16 or 18 cassettes telling you how to go through a sales process in a particular industry. That's what this is. I mean, except you can take it with you everywhere. That's the beautiful part. Everything old is new again, right? There's nothing new about creating a brilliant, let's say, true crime show. They were doing that in the 30s on radio. That was Dick Tracy, right? This is nothing new. It's just that everybody can put it in their pockets. They can walk around with it. They can listen on the train. They can listen in the car. But these concepts have been around forever. So think about that. I love these training podcasts. I love the idea of creating a podcast that even your competitors can listen into. It sounds like it's a risky initiative, but if you're looking to attract and train professionals and you come out with an incredible training seminar and you put it out into the public, that's a pretty bold move that kind of says, we're not worried about you ripping off our process because we're the best. That's another demonstration of authority that a podcast can do.
Or you could think about this maybe like in the selling real estate space. Somebody can be producing like really great training and sales tips and things to make you a better person in the real estate market. Well, we know that the real estate agent market is very transient. And if somebody comes across that content and they learn that your company is producing all of this great content to help skill up their agents, you might be like, I think I want to be part of that team. So it's a way to attract people there.
Right. And again, it's no different than, sometimes when we're educating a new prospect to come in to be an agency client and they say, yeah, I get that we want to be known on the search engines, but I really don't want to give away my special sauce. You have to be confident enough as an organization and as a business to let all of that go because yes, somebody might pick it off. Somebody might try to replicate those efforts, but they're never going to be as authentic and as much of an expert in that subject matter as you are. Better to claim ownership of it from the get-go and put it out into the universe and claim it than to allow somebody else to come into the space and do the exact same thing. So don't be nervous about really, if you have an internal training podcast, you want to keep it strictly internal, that's great. But don't be afraid to put it out into the universe because it's just going to demonstrate that you can't be caught.
Yeah. And then the last one, the one that most companies come in like, I want to start a podcast. It's because they're seeking fame. The idea behind a fame podcast is great. It's beautiful, but it's very hard to do. It's very unlikely that you starting your podcast will be respected the way Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, Mark Maron. It's just really hard to establish your entire business. Now, that said, Jed has mentioned that the idea behind you have your core business, you have your core service offering, and you can have this edge initiative of producing a podcast that you do seek to be an influencer, to develop your fame, to develop yourself as somebody who speaks really intelligently. And next thing you know, you're speaking, you're getting paid for it, you're developing this other side business where you are semi-famous, you are an influencer, you are an authority in that space. So it is something that is a possibility.
Right. Like you mentioned, Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss created a book that went global, and it caught fire, and then everybody kind of knew who he was. And then he had some seminars and, maybe an expo, and then eventually launched a podcast. Well, we're in the era now where it's more likely that somebody will create a podcast and get known for doing that podcast and catch fire with that, and then upcycle that into a book. So again, they're all the same type of assets. It's just the discoverability is flipping, and it's beginning to favor being discovered and being found through these circumstances. Having said that, be very careful, because as Jon mentioned, inevitably the question arises, well, when somebody approaches us about producing a podcast, well, should my CEO host the podcast? And this is where we're going to throw stones in a glass house. So Jon is the president, and he hosts Inbound and Down. We're launching a new show called Grow for Good, where I'm the host of it, and we're doing it. But we're doing it really without the idea of becoming famous. We are doing it for expertise, authority, and trust. But we've also been broadcast professionals for years and years. It's not easy to do this, believe it or not. You can't just open up a microphone, begin speaking, and then assume that people are going to follow you. So we always say, the answer is yes. If you insist on hosting the show and you want to be discovered, but just have very, very low expectations about how popular the show is going to be based upon how, gregarious your personality happens to be, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be popular or famous. Some of the most famous celebrities on planet Earth have started podcasts and stopped doing them a handful of shows into it, because it's hard. It's hard to be compelling for hours and hours and hours. And after a while, you realize, maybe I don't have that much to say.
Mm-hmm. So that does bring me to what you need to know if you do want to consider actually starting a podcast. So a few things for you to consider. First of all, it can't just be because your CEO, whoever the personality is that you want to be on it, is incredibly intelligent or incredibly entertaining, funny. You need to really identify, who is it for? Like, what is the purpose of getting these recorded pieces of content together? Who are you producing this for? Is it for recruitment? Is it for your prospects? Is it for your existing customers? Or is it just for yourself? At least identifying who you're producing this for from the get-go will help you keep you on track as far as what type of content you're producing.
That should sound familiar to inbound marketers.
Right.
You don't just write a piece to write a piece. You consider the persona you're developing it for. It's exactly the same process. And then you have to think about, well, what's the format of it? How long is it? That's the same thing as determining whether this particular subject warrants a blog post, maybe just an email, or a pillar page. Mm-hmm. So are you going to be hardcore history and clock in at 3 hours or 8 hours? Or are you going to be Neil Patel and Eric Sue's marketing school and clock in at about 30 seconds, right? I mean, but there's a format and a rationale behind producing all those different types of content. Eric Sue is actually probably a good example, because you can listen to Eric talk for an hour and a half on a particular subject on maybe his show, or he's being interviewed on another show. He has a few outlets. Mm-hmm. And then he has Marketing School with Neil Patel, where they put it out, and they're just little bite-sized chunks. Like, let me tell you all about this Google algorithm update. And they hit it, they give you what you need, and they're out. So considering who it's for is persona development. Considering what the format is going to be is just determining what type of content you're going to produce.
Yeah, and something else to come into this thinking about is a lot of people look at it as the infinite podcast. I'm going to start and it will just keep going and keep fueling itself, and it's going to be incredible. Well, I kind of caution you against pursuing it that way. Consider doing a season-based model. This way you can say, I'm setting out and I'm planning 12 episodes, 12 definitive episodes. So you can say what the topics are for each of those episodes, and you know what you need to cover in every single one. When it's the infinite podcast, often people fall into the trap of saying, you know what, I'll get to this, or I covered this previously, I don't need to cover this again. And also you end up kind of losing steam. You end up petering out. You end up, you were once a week, every single week for the first 6 weeks. And then you took a week off because you remembered you still have to sell. You still have a job to do. So maybe you skipped a week. And next thing you know, I'm looking back on your podcast and the last episode was in May of 2017 and it just looks like a failure. Rather than looking like you fail, let's actually map out something that you can say, we are going to begin here. This is part 1 of 12. We're going to finish with part 12 of 12. Thank you for joining us. It looks like a successful endeavor. The money that you spent, the time that you spent, the resources you invested turned into something that was actually valuable and something that you can really be proud of.
So let's think about how to start then. Right? So how would you actually begin the process? You've got your team internally, you own a business, you've got maybe your marketing person, your sales director around you, your head of operations, and the idea of starting a podcast comes into the conference room. Mm-hmm. What are the first steps?
Yeah. So we actually recommend that people try and do a dry run. When we were considering doing Inbound and Down for Morey Creative, I grabbed myself some whiskey, sat outside, and recorded on my iPhone about 4 different episodes just to see, first of all, can I carry a conversation? Can I move from topic to topic without just hitting a wall and being like, somebody else take over? It's a challenge. You're going to learn that this is actually very hard to do. So sitting down with your team and recording a dry run, even if it's you recording it with no intention of you actually being the host, this will help you work out what's the format. Okay, so at this point, we're going to have the intro music. We'll do a little ad that's going to be promoting this thing. Let's do an inspire session. Okay, that felt right. All right, let's take a break. Maybe we'll do some music in between and you'll kind of work out, okay, that was too long. When you listen back to it, you might be like, that was silly. I don't think that we actually achieved what we wanted to, or that could have been a lot shorter.
One of the other things that you can do is actually commit pen to paper, sit down and take Jon's suggestion of not doing an infinite podcast, but we're going to do a season. And these are the 12 episodes that we're going to do. Actually write them out, give an outline. Mm-hmm. Can you be authoritative and can you be an expert in writing for 12 different subjects? And the anecdote that I usually give people is when we were in publishing, we published an alternative weekly for 15 years. And not a week went by when somebody would approach me and say, I'm going to write a column for you. And don't worry, you don't have to pay me. That was always the gift. Like, it's okay. It's free of charge. And I would say, terrific. Give me 8, make sure that they're between 700 and 900 words, as clean copy as you can, and all on different subjects. And they'd say, like now, like 8 in a row. Everybody has 1 or 2 articles in them. Maybe in your lifetime, you have a book in you. Maybe you have a half a dozen podcasts in you as well. Commit it to paper, write them out. Can you actually come up with 12 different subjects and then create an outline that you can speak to or the people in your organization can speak to, because it's not easy. Then this is a trick of the trade, like Jon mentioned. Put your iPhone in the middle of your conference room table and hit record and put everybody on the spot. Watch how many people in the room freeze the first few times that you do it. It's not easy.
So you'd mentioned the team that's in the room. Let's actually talk about who that might be. We've identified on this slide what we call a starter team. And there are only 3 key roles that we need to worry about. First is that host. What are the responsibilities of the host? Jed, you want to talk about a host's responsibilities?
Sure. The host doesn't have to actually be the most knowledgeable person about the subject matter if you're going with an interview format or if you're getting other voices involved. Having a group at your disposal means having somebody who is the leader of the conversation, and that is the host. Being a good host means knowing how to throw the ball to the person to advance the conversation. It also means listening to the answers that they're giving so that you're not just reading the next question off and having a series of non sequiturs. Mm-hmm. You have to actually listen and engage. So communication specialists, anybody that came up maybe through theater, anybody that's ever been on the radio before, these are the type of people that have these skills to be able to actually conduct and carry an interview. Again, it's not an easy skill to achieve. I started out in college radio and was terrible. Went into the broadcasting industry after that, was still terrible for a very long time. We were in publishing and we had the opportunity to speak in public. And it took years and years to get comfortable to host a panel, moderate a panel, sit on the stage and know that you could guide a conversation when you're being thrown curveballs every step of the way. That's the role of a host. The host is not the smartest person in the room. They're just the person that knows how to carry a conversation.
So the next really key role is the engineer. Now, what is an engineer? This is the person that needs to understand the equipment that we're going to be leveraging. We'll talk about what that recommended equipment is. This is also someone that needs to understand sound design. We did our little trial run on your iPhone. That doesn't mean that you should be recording these episodes on an iPhone. It's important to understand equipment and make sure that you're getting really top level quality.
Yeah, if I can just say for a sec, though, that in the beginning stages, the nascent stages of the podcasting industry, so to speak, most of the shows had terrible audio quality. And that was okay. You could actually break out and have a show that didn't sound great. You don't have that luxury anymore. Podcasting has matured enough where sound really, really matters.
Yeah, there are so many factors that can make somebody tune in and then immediately tune out. Another thing that the engineer needs to be able to understand is actual music and content direction. So having good taste and insight into like, what type of theme music can we have? How should this be structured? And then it's the editing. Sitting down in front of your software and being able to chop up the audio, because inevitably there will be ums and there will be dead air, or there will be somebody accidentally cursing or whatever it might be. You need the ability to kind of tighten that up and make it something that's as digestible and incredible as possible. And then the last role is that producer. This is somebody who coordinates everything.
This is actually the smartest person in the room.
Yeah. I mean, the producer of our podcast, Inbound and Down, is Sage Levine, and she really does God's work in that she lets me, as, call me the talent, really just take it easy and breathe and meditate and be ready to roll. And she does all of the show prep and the amount of research and preparation that she does with the guests that we have on. And then the show notes that I have, I am just ready to roll without having to worry about actually coordinating. So there is that coordinating. If you have guests, you have to schedule with them. You have to get the software that they're going to be using to tune in. So it's worried about coordinating schedules, coordinating the artwork for your episodes, and publishing it and sharing it. What's your distribution like? So this person really does do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to a show. They're in the background, but they're very, very important to the process.
Yeah, one of the things that Jon just touched on is you have to imagine that you're probably not going to have the luxury of having, if you have an interview format, doesn't mean you have an interview every single show, but let's say you have an interview, you probably don't have the luxury of that person sitting right next to you or sitting across from you. So this gets back to a great host can conduct that conversation and not have the person in the room. But a great producer knows how to walk the guest through the technological aspects of being able to actually log on and have quality audio come through from the other side. It is it's a very involved process, even though the technology has really been streamlined and it's so easy to adopt. It's different. It's new for people. So again, that's why that producer role it seems to touch every single stage of the production.
Yeah. Now let's talk about equipment. So Sage, our producer, has actually built out an entire guide, a DIY guide to the equipment that you can leverage, which we're going to link to. But in general, this type of stuff that you're going to need. This is something that's often overlooked, is a very controlled sound environment. You can't just go into your conference room, because as soon as your HVAC kicks on, it is picked up by every single microphone that's in that room. So you need a sound controlled environment. You need good microphones. We actually stumbled with this in the beginning, where we had microphones that were maybe left over from some of our radio days, and they're a couple of years old. The quality is really distracting. So you need to make sure that you have like a really high quality microphone, something that's going to pick up you and limit all of the other distracting noises that might be around you in the room.
Yeah, we knew it was an issue when we began to interview people that had better microphones and sound quality than we did in the studio. Yeah. That's when you got to really kind of up your game.
Sounds like you're the guest on your own show. You probably need a mixer. So if you think about a conversation like this, there's Jed and I, and if this is just an audio format and we want to do some editing and Jed and I are stepping over each other, we're speaking into our microphones. If you are recording into different channels, you then have the ability when you're editing to say, well, let me just remove that sneeze from his channel and now we're good over here. So you're going to need some mixer. A computer can sometimes do it directly, but having an actual mixer is really the best route. You're going to need that software that I mentioned before, having Audacity or Audition. We leverage Audition because we're on the Creative Cloud, the Adobe Creative Cloud platform. And then there's distribution. Distribution is clutch. You might be publishing and just say, okay, cool, I'm going to go to Spotify alone and publish there. Well, we're talking about being delivered in search results. The things that are being delivered in search results are actually Google Podcasts. Mm-hmm. So you can publish to a platform like Libsyn, that's what we leverage, and Libsyn allows you to then distribute it to many, many different platforms.
Yeah, and this may change, and I assume it probably already has by just from the beginning of the show. But if you your voice-enabled device at home, if you ask your Google device to play a show, it's going to come through Google. If you ask Alexa, it's a partnership with TuneIn. Some formats like Stitcher is a pretty popular platform. Spotify's taking over the world. You're going to find that podcasts probably find their way into other streaming platforms as well, is my guess. But podcasts are available everywhere. Again, the point, just like inbound marketing, of having a show that's distributed widely is to be where people are. Don't make them struggle to find you. That's why we failed with the Read, Watch, Listen initiative, because the technology and the capabilities to distribute this audio platform widely didn't really exist in the manner that it does today. Having a piece of audio live on a web page where you really had to access it through your desktop wasn't a great user experience, right? So we were never going to get scale with that. Now you can get scale with audio. A distribution platform like Libsyn is the way to do it. So what Libsyn essentially does, and there are other services that do this, is you send your podcast, your show, to one central place that then distributes it to all of the different networks. Along with that, is your title descriptions, your metadata, and your show art. These are really important assets that you need to enhance discoverability, but also appeal to your audience. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but even something as simple as show art is massively important to being found, because again, even though it's a great time to get into the game because there's only 700,000 podcasts out there, there are 700,000 podcasts out there. So you have to leverage any tool that you have to stand out.
So for that equipment, again, there's a guide that we've produced that Sage has written. It can be found at moreycreative.com/DIY podcast. And that can, really give you a good directory of exact types of microphones and whatnot that you might want to consider. So what we just described might sound a little bit intimidating. It's because it should be. It's a difficult thing to do. It's possible. You're very smart, very capable people. And, with that guide, you might be able to go out and actually get off the ground and start running. But there's also the option to outsource your podcasting services. And that's where Morey Creative comes in. The things that can be achieved when you're outsourcing are everything that Jed just described. And I'm just going to run down what this slide says here. Mm-hmm. Helping develop what that concept is and working through what we've discussed here. Working on your branding. What is it titled? People often try and get cute and come up with creative little names. If we're talking about discoverability, don't make it more difficult than it needs to be. Put what you want to be found in the title of your name.
Say what you mean to say.
There's also a very interesting thing going on. You can, if a web domain is taken, well, too bad for you. If a show name is taken, well, it's kind of the Wild West right now. I'm not sure exactly how the world's going to deal with this, but there are actually, we have Inbound and Down. Some other jabroni started an Inbound and Down as well.
That's true. Yeah, we're making no claims about how long that's going to last. This being the Wild West, at some point, I'm sure that there'll be some sort of not regulatory body, but they'll figure out how to get that under control. But for right now, I don't know. Go get it.
Yeah. And also, being able to secure that domain along the lines, if that's what you're referring to. And then running through this, we also need, you need assistance with recording and editing, the helping with a professional host. We might talk you out of actually hosting yourself. Yes, if we're trying to build expertise and authority and trustworthiness, then shouldn't it be you speaking? Not necessarily hosting it. Yes, you're going to be a guest. You're going to be driving the conversation. You're going to be the authority. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be the host. So it's something that we actually often talk through. Helping produce those show notes. So with the producer coming up with everything that the host needs to know, everything that they need in front of them, coming up with or assisting with booking, helping with distribution. And then after something's produced, what happens after that? Is there transcription that needs to be done? We did say that Google is already indexing content, but you've just produced a bunch of great content. Why not transcribe it and republish that and now let it be found through a text means?
You can also carve it up and use audio clips on social media.
Yep.
Just design a background, you put the audio clip in there, and you've got now new leveraged assets that will, serve the greater good of getting your content found.
Yeah, and not to mention, there is the analytics and reporting that needs to come after all this is done. Don't you want to know what the return on your investment has been? You're going to be able to feel some things tangibly where you're like, people are talking about it, and there's a boost in morale around here. But to be able to look at how many people are downloading, and who's spending time on that content, and are those pages that you're maybe publishing specific to your podcast actually ranking? So,
if there's one thing that I want to make sure that we leave everybody with, this is not a tomorrow thing. This is happening. This is today. That slide that Jon showed earlier about search engines, if podcasts are being served already as results on the SERPs, then what are you waiting for?
Yeah. So you've done the right thing by at least expressing interest in this, but there is work to do. So let's get started. If you want to learn more specifically about Morey Creative services, you can find information at moreycreative.com/podcasts. Feel free to reach out and we can just have an exploratory call, maybe point you in the right direction. But in any event, we appreciate you joining us, and thanks for all of your time here.
Take care.